Hey groupers, it's Pastor Marshall. I hope that you're having a great week. I hope you enjoyed the worship services this last weekend and enjoyed the message in God's Word at the very last two narratives in Luke chapter 19. Get things started, want to have an icebreaker. Joshua Harris wrote a book that was entitled, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. It was a really popular book in Christian circles. Essentially, Josh's premise was that dating is dangerous. That dating sets us up to where we become selfish. That's one of the consequences of dating. And then also, things might happen on a date that we just don't want to happen. Harris doesn't suggest that we never date. He really is suggesting that we don't date frivolously. We don't just date anybody and everybody. So his premise is that we would make a list of character traits, non-negotiables, things that are on our list, and we will never date anybody who doesn't already possess these qualities, these character traits. That we won't enter into a romantic relationship with anyone who doesn't already possess these qualities. Did you ever make a list of the qualities that your mate would have? That's what I'd like you to get talking about first, just to get the ice broken, just to get the conversation started. I had a list. First of all, the person that I would marry had to already be a faithful, believing churchgoer, believing in Jesus Christ and faithfully committed to the church. And I also was not going to date anyone who wasn't already committed to full-time Christian service, because I was going to be a pastor, and I didn't want someone that would be in full-time Christian service that didn't want to be. And purity was also very high on my list. I was not going to date anyone who hadn't made the same commitments to purity that I had made. Well, what about you? Could you talk about in your group, if you ever had a list, what did that list look like? And did you stay with that list, or did you violate it? I stayed with my list, and I'm very thankful that I did. Well, second, it's impossible to list all of the character traits of Jesus. Jesus is God, and so by very nature, he is infinite. But in today's study, we want to talk about two of Jesus' character traits. Jesus shows that he is tender. He sheds tears in this passage. And then second, he shows that he is tough. He goes into the temple, he drives out those that are selling. I wonder, besides these two, what character trait, just one character trait, if everybody in the group would share one character trait about Jesus that is very important to you, that you would say, when I think of Jesus' character, I think about this, and you would fill in the blank. Next, in the first of the two narratives, Jesus is overlooking Jerusalem. This is on Sunday. We believe it's on Sunday evening. He has just gone through his triumphal entry. It's the same day as his triumphal entry. He looks over Jerusalem and he sheds strong tears of sorrow. What about you? Have you ever seriously wept? And what was the occasion? I remember my grandfather, who was very, very close to me, and I was very close to him, major influence in my life. My grandfather had a series of strokes, the final one severe, and he was going to spend the last 2 years of his life in a nursing home and not really very responsive. I was here in California. I made a trip out to say goodbye to my grandfather. He wasn't doing very well. He hadn't passed away yet, but I went to see him in the home where he was staying. And what you may not know about my grandfather is that I look a lot like him. So I went to see him. He couldn't respond really at all. I didn't know if he even knew that I was there. Laying there in the bed, I prayed, and then I wanted to say goodbye to him, and I got close to him in his face, and it was like looking in a mirror. And I told him that I loved him, and I told him that I knew that he did not want this, and I told him that I would continue to pray that the Lord would take him home. And in that moment, he looked back at me with eyes of recognition. And I understood that his body was prohibiting him from acting or communicating but his mind was working, and he was suffering terribly because of that. I left his room, and I wept. Strong tears. What about you? Can you remember the last time that you really wept, and what was the occasion? The second narrative in our story is Jesus going into the temple courts. The court of the Gentiles had been set up as a marketplace, and there are people there that are selling sacrifices for a significant inflated price, and there are money changers. You have to change whatever coins you have brought to temple coins, and then there's a fee for that transaction. This is the second time that Jesus will go into the temple and drive out the money changers and drive out the sellers. The first time happened at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, 3 years before this event. This is the second time. And Jesus is going to drive out, he's going to take a stand against these hucksters. My definition of hucksters are people who are more focused on personal profit than the teaching of the prophet. My question is, what has your experience been with hucksters? Have you experienced any hucksters? And if so, would you please share what that experience was, and did you do anything about it? Another grandpa story. My grandfather was a businessman, a very successful businessman. And so I had begun preaching, and my grandfather liked my preaching. He thought that I was a good preacher. I graduated from graduate school and was planting a church, and I wasn't going to be living at home. And my grandfather called me, and he said he wanted to meet when I was home. And we met, and he said he had a business proposition for me, a church business proposition for me. He said that he wanted to build me a church, that he would build the church, he would pay for the cost of the land and the building and all of that. And then I would start the church and lead the church and preach, and he wanted just 50% of the profits. Well, my grandfather was a Christian man, but obviously not the same kind of devotion as myself. He was a businessman too. I had to politely tell my grandfather that that wasn't going to work. That's not my commitment. That's not how church works. Well, what do I like in this passage? I like tender Jesus. My background has made me think of God as tough first. My instinct is to think of God as tough, to think of God as someone that's paying attention to mistakes. I love the reminder that Jesus is tender first, that he is not primarily focused on my mistakes, that he's focused on his love for me. I like that. What do I not like? Well, I don't think it's a surprise. I don't like that they are making God's house into a marketplace. I don't like that they're taking advantage of faithful people by ripping them off. The high priest is in charge of all of this. His purpose is to make atonement for the people, but he is not fulfilling his purpose. He has made his purpose profit off of people. I don't like that. Quick reminder about the application. There were 2 applications this last weekend in my message because there were 2 different passages, and so I'll remind you about these 2 applications. First, I challenged you to decide that you would withhold judgment against anybody or anything that you had not already wept or grieved strongly over. I think our tendency is to judge quickly about things that we don't lose any sleep over. And Jesus clearly lost sleep over this city, and he weeps tears. And so I challenge you to make a commitment that you would withhold judgment about things that you haven't wept over. And then second, that you would make a commitment to guard the flock, that you would decide that you would stand up against any hucksters that you ever experienced, that you would take a strong stand. Well, I hope that you have a great group. I sure appreciate the time that you allow me to spend in your group, and I look forward to seeing you this next weekend. God bless.